Is your render farm in need of a render diet? Let's talk. Hey, please subscribe, and if you like what you see here, maybe share it on social media and click the like button. Well, that's right, a render diet. What I mean by that is that every shot has a whole series of renders, and if you can trim some of those render footprints down, you can really trim costs. We're going to look at that today. Now, I'm not an artist. I don't actually use render farms the way an artist would. But the reality is you don't have to be a professional driver to be a traffic engineer. And that's really what I've done over the years is I spent at least 12 years of my 25 years in this business focused on render traffic engineering. And how do we get the most amount of renders through the farm in a particular day and do it in the most cost-effective way that we can. So we are going to dive into a spreadsheet to start off with. I know artists don't always like looking at spreadsheets. A lot of people don't like looking at spreadsheets, but I'll try to keep it simple. And it's really the easiest way to calculate some costs, because that's really in the end what we need to do here is figure out how much is it going to cost to render this, and can we reduce those costs and still get it out on time. So let's take a look at the spreadsheet. So to start breaking down this shot, we're going to assume that a VFX crew is going to be working on a shot that is of significant size. We'll say it's 90 frames, and it's a fairly medium to hard shot. So it's got all the stages in it. Let's go through those stages. With ingestion, this just means that this movie's going to come in and you're going to probably need to break it up into frames or do something, whatever your pipeline does to the initial work that comes in from the client. Layout and match move, they're going to have to do the full 90 frame shot, and they may want to render it a few times, at least in daily, so everyone else can see the layout. So again, I assumed 4 iterations for this, and I'm assuming these are all running at 4 cores per job, and just minutes per frame. These are very small jobs in terms of rendering. We get into modeling, and they may need to do their renders, and those renders actually are in the form of turntables, so there can be more frames to make a nice, slow, smooth turntable. But again, it's just going to be maybe a minute per frame or 2 minutes per frame. Dailies, if modeling wants to show it in QuickTime format out to the team, again, those are usually pretty quick. As we start to get into animation, it's where we start to see things pick up. We might start using 8-core machines now because they need those animation test renders turned around quickly. They're usually working on them throughout the day, running little renders, and they need to see them fast. So, and these can take now, started getting up into maybe 4 minutes per frame. And as we get into those final renders for animation, maybe they take as much as 12 minutes per frame running on an 8-core machine. And then again, some dailies at the end, because there's always some dailies to make some quick times and pass it around to the crew so everyone else can review the work as it progresses. Now we're going to get into effects. Effects is where we start seeing bigger, heavier loads of render queue hours. Effects simulations, they may be the initial stage. It's just going to be a couple of sims. You don't need to run those on big cores because they don't multi-thread as well. So we'll assume, and again, an 8-core machine. And this can take up to maybe 12 hours. And then the effects test renders, that simulation is going to generate frames that need to be rendered. And those, again, now we're going to assume here that it's only maybe 45 frames. Maybe not the full shot has the effects work in it, but it's still 45 frames. And these are going to maybe take 8 hours a frame to render. So now we're really starting to get up there in total core hours. Now, finally, again, there's going to be some effects dailies as they prune these out. This will be a small infinitesimal portion of the render footprint. Let's talk about lighting. Lighting is going to have the full 90 frames of this shot they're going to need to render. And this is going to have 16 cores now because these lighting renders are very heavy and it's still taking 16 hours per frame to get these done. So these are very heavy renders that are going on. You're going to need the full frame range, again, 90 frames. It's the entire shot needs to be lit. And some dailies at the end. Those will be infinitesimal compared to the rest. Some comp renders, when the compositing stages happens, they're going to need to do a whole series of renders. I put down 8 different iterations of those renders. And we'll have to do a couple of final dailies and output the client delivery. Those last stages, again, take a very small amount of farm. And if we look at the totals now of the core hours in dollars for these stages, well, really effects and lighting is around 99% of that render footprint in this particular shot. So going forward, if we're going to try to figure out how to prune or reduce this shot, I promise you I will be looking exclusively at effects and lighting, and that's where all the meat is. So what's the point of even trying to trim the less than 1% portion of your render footprint? So of these 365,000 core hours, how can we get them down so that we're not spending so much time and money? I'm also going to be talking a lot about core hours. I've already talked about it a little bit. And if you haven't seen one of my previous videos, I'm going to show a 1-minute video here of what core hours means. And if you already know what a core hour is, well, then just go ahead and skip ahead right here, and you can just skip over this next minute. So the core hours is a base unit of measurement. It goes like this. Let's imagine you have a machine with 20 cores on it, and you decide to put a frame on that machine to render, and you're going to give it all 20 cores of that machine, and it renders, and it only takes 1 hour. Well, that means that that frame cost you in your studio 20 core hours, meaning it took 20 cores over an hour. So the math starts to bake out. Like if it took 2 hours to do that same frame, well, then it took 40 core hours because it now took 2 hours on a 20 core machine. Conversely, let's say you're going to put two 10 core frames on that machine. So you're going to run 2 frames at the same time, and they're each going to use 10 cores of that machine. And let's say that they each complete in an hour. Well, each frame took 10 core hours. And that machine still was 20 core hours worth of processing, but now it was split between 2 frames. So now that we've built out this shot, we've looked at how much it costs, we need to figure out what can we do to reduce the cost. And I want to talk a little bit about the iron triangle. The client wants it to look great, they want it cheap, and they want it fast. Now you may have heard this before, but the iron triangle states that you can only really get 2 of those 3. You can get it cheap and fast, you can get it cheap and great, or you can get it fast and great, but you can't get all 3. Something has to give. And when you look at the iron triangle in the terms of how are you going to reduce your render footprint, you can take these same 3 general principles of great, fast, and cheap and turn it into cost, quality, and time. Those are the real 3 factors that we're talking about here. Now, when it comes to the client expectations, you can't really reduce the client expectations. So the quality is often fixed by the time you're into this project. They're expecting a certain level of quality. It's going to be hard to reduce that. Time, well, it's usually a pretty big ask to ask a client to push a deadline out. To deliver something weeks late is a mark on your record normally. And so generally the deadline is locked in. Well, on costs, which is what we're going to look at here, you can't really charge the client more. So you're going to have to figure out how are you going to reduce the cost of this and not charge the client more. Now let's take a look at the different ways. With quality, you can reduce the resolution of some of this. You can, at least in earlier stages, which we'll talk about in a moment, you can reduce the quality by lowering the resolution. You can create less frame rates, right? Go from 60 to 30 or 30 to 10, and it's going to cost drastically less. Frame counts are actually the biggest X factor in render costs. In other words, a 90 frame shot and a 200 frame shot, even if it's the same general shot, one's going to cost twice as much to render. So you'll find that the biggest X factor is frame counts in general. Time. Well, if you want to try to reduce the time, you can do less iterations. You can optimize the render so that you're using less minutes per render, or you can add more farm and crew so that you can get more done in the same amount of time. With cost, it's kind of a similar thing. It's the opposite end of the coin. You can do less iterations to reduce the cost. You can optimize those renders, or you can add more farm and crew. There's really only so many options you have when a shot's running over budget or things are getting expensive. And so what I want to look at is how can we reduce the cost of this by playing with the quality and time, but not really affecting the final output to the client. So the client still sees the same quality in the same time, but you can kind of play with it a little bit. Let's talk about that. Now, like I said before, almost all the costs of this shot are in the effects and lighting. So we're going to forget about all the rest of those shots and just look at the handful of stages that I identified of effects and lighting, and you'll see why I categorized them as QC versus test and then finals. So let's take a look at those. Now, you're generally going to be running some early test renders, and if you can run those test renders at every other frame, you'll reduce the total cost of those renders by 50%. You can reduce it by a great multiplier of more than double again if you lower the resolution. So if you do those at low res and you do them every other frame, you will reduce that cost. Now, this is just the early stages. This is just to see if it's looking kind of how you intend. You'll see often in a lot of the big shops, they'll say run it on 10s. That means you're going to only run one out of every 10 frames, and you're going to only get, a real jittery image if you're trying to look at the flow of the shot. At least just by cutting it in half, or running it on 2s, I guess you could say, and running every other frame, you're going to immediately do a 50% reduction of the total render footprint this is going to require of the farm and of cost, just by taking that one early step. So I always recommend at the earliest stages, run them on less frames. If you can run them on 10s, that's great, but at the very least, run every other frame. The next stage is the QC render. So you're getting closer. You're wanting to start to show your work to others. And so now maybe you run the full frame range, but you're still running it at a medium or low resolution. This will, again, greatly reduce the hours it's going to take, but you can, with this extra second small step, greatly reduce the total footprint. But I'm going to show you how much of a savings these couple of little steps can make. And then the final lighting renders, where you're doing your final renders for effects or lighting, then just run them at full frame range and full resolution. Of course, you've got to see the final product for any little artifacts that only pop up when you go to full res, and you need to get this into the artist or to the client's hands looking as good as you promised. So you're going to need to render those last ones at full res, at full frame range. Nothing you can do about that, but those previous steps will have saved you plenty. In fact, if you implement these steps and you do test renders with a reduced frame count, and you do your QC renders and you continue those at a medium resolution or a low resolution, you can save as much as 58% of the total core hours that you're going to end up consuming for this shot. That means you're only using 42% of the core hours that you originally were going to use, and that means that you're only paying 42% of the price that you're originally planning to spend on this shot. That's a huge savings. Moreover, let's look at how this would work if you were in an on-prem farm. This may not be the only shot you have to do. This just may be one shot of the award. Let's assume you've got a standard render farm, and let's see how these shots would work on a real render farm. Now let's assume that you've got 89 machines on your render farm, whether that's in a rack or on your floor. Let's assume you've got 89 machines that are dedicated to your render farm, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, and on each of those machines are 20 cores. Well, that means you've got approximately 300,000 core hours per week. Now you can plot that on a graph and look at your render farm on a weekly basis. So if you look at the shot that we just broke down and you put it onto this farm, it's going to spread across 3 weeks. It's a general assumption for your average shot to just be in shot production for 3 weeks. Believe me, there's a wide variation. It's a good assumption for this model. So we'll assume it's going to run a couple thousand core hours in the first week. It's going to do about 46,000 core hours in the second week. And the bulk of that rendering is going to happen in the third week of 138,000 core hours. And with 300,000 core hours per week available to you at this farm, you've got more than enough capacity and wiggle room to do this one shot. No worries, you're good. But there's more than one shot. Let's assume you've got 10 shots of these, all of these same exact shots, but you've got 10 of them, and you've got 10 weeks to do it in. Well, when you pile them all on top of each other and you schedule them all one after another, so the next shot's beginning as the last shot's starting to ramp down, and you lay them all on top of each other to fit them in that 10-week period, well, now you've got a problem. You add up all those core hours, and you've now exceeded your capacity. You need more farm. Now, by doing those steps that I just pointed out, taking the QC renders and the test renders and reducing them by those modest amounts in the earliest stages of your farm use, you'll see that the 10 shots on a diet gets you in. You will be able to do that entire round of work, all 10 shots on that size farm with 300,000 core hours per week, and get it all done just fine. And this is done by just reducing those initial renders to being half res and running on less than full frame range when you do your initial tests. It has a huge effect, and this is often all that is needed for a studio to get a show through or not. It's not that they have to change the world. You just need to reduce a small number of your steps, your early steps, and everything else can still run at full res. So let's assume you've got these 10 shots and you've got 300,000 core hours per week available, and your artists are not going to go on a diet. They're going to render the full frame, full res. That's just how it's going to be. Well, then the only other option you have, according to the Iron Triangle, is to push off the time. And that means that you can now squeeze these renders into the extra couple of weeks, and you will effectively be late. You'll deliver with 300,000 core hours per week of your render farm, and your artist won't have to worry about going on a diet, but you'll just deliver to the client 2 weeks late. 2 weeks late on a 10-week project is crazy. The other downside is those last shots will not really get started until very late, and the client will see you as a fourth quarter studio. And that means that you're not showing your work to them till you get to the fourth quarter of the game. And the clients do not like working with fourth quarter studios. They want to see early versions of that work early on. This pushing things down the pipeline to the end and pushing late will also mean that you'll be considered not only a studio or a crew that delivers late, but it delivers fourth quarter work. So you can't see what it's really going to look like to the very end. You don't want that reputation. And there are other ways to diet, just to reduce that shot size. Again, I mentioned optimization. I'm not an artist. I can't tell you where to reduce sample sizes and change planes and where cameras are set and whether objects are flying through cameras. That's up to you, the artist community, to reduce and optimize your renders. If you're on a show and you do have some jobs that seem to have really long frame times, I highly encourage you to talk to your other artists on the crew and have them maybe peek at your shot and see if there's any low-hanging fruit you might have missed. As you've seen in some of these numbers, when you can reduce by half the time of a shot, you can make the difference between a whole show getting through a farm or a whole show delivering a couple of weeks late. That's the difference in taking a handful of shots and reducing them by half when it comes to render times. You want to reduce the frames and reduce the size of those frames in the earliest stages, especially with effects, lighting, look devs, another area. And if you can do that and still render full frame range and full res at the end, you'll still find that you'll get 20-30% reductions in your total farm footprint. And that can sometimes make the difference between getting it through on an on-prem farm versus running late, or being able to run on the cloud and being able to burst really quickly and not blow your budget all at the same time. Whichever direction you go, these techniques will help you, cloud or on-prem. I hope this helped. If you have any questions about this, put comments below. And I can always share out some of this work or some of these spreadsheets if anyone has an interest. Well, thanks everyone. And remember, when you get onto that render farm, make sure every core hour counts and you're always using the least amount of farm possible to get the job done. Thanks.